So I was watching this video, right, called I think it was The Problem with Ghost Hunting or Ghost Hunters or whatever. And it wasn't your typical oh, the whole thing's fake, or even the oh, the whole thing's real, you're all just being annoying. Um the lady who was talking, I can't remember what her name was, but she was all like, you know, I'm I don't believe all of it, but there's always some things. And she kind of like picked like the middle ground, horseshoe, not horseshoe, middle ground. you know I'm not buying into it, but then again, people who are adamant, like, oh no, this is 100% not true, might not be right too. And she said something that got me thinking. It came to a bit of a realization that I don't think it's anything new, but it's something new to me, or maybe not new to me. Maybe I'm just tired and don't remember things. She said, maybe years from now we might discover something that, like, it's not exactly ghosts, but, um, people didn't believe bacteria. People, like 100 years ago, people didn't think bacteria or cells existed, or something along those lines of, that 100 years ago, we didn't know these things existed. A lot of things that exist, we didn't know existed like 100 years ago. That's way too soon. Like a couple 100 years ago, we didn't know existed. And, that got me thinking, like, well, that doesn't work for ghosts, because no, when cells were first existed, the guy didn't say, oh man, these are cells. Well, actually he did, but that was completely different reasons. The reason a cell is called a cell is because they look like, well, cells, like little, like, rooms. And a cell was like a term for a room that a monk would live in, like a small empty room with very little things in it, because the man who discovered them, or first saw them with a microscope or telescope, depending on what your perspective is, uh, was a monk who looked at a piece of cork, and dead cork looks like, well, empty cells, empty rooms. So that's why I called them cells, and that's all, that's why they're called cells. But anyway, so he didn't think, oh man, these things that everybody thought existed for a while are true. Same thing goes for bacteria. People thought that disease was caused by um, bad smells, which, to be fair, made some sense, because, I mean, look at the Black Death. It spread through contact with things that smelled rather rancid, bodily waste, the diseased and dying, people who are already dead. It all smelled terrible, and if you're by it, of course it's gonna smell awful. And they weren't exactly wrong, because, like, even, like, cause things that tend to smell awful to us smell awful because they're bad to us. It's not because it's toxic or could get us sick. And it's contaminated. We don't want that bias, so we kind of evolved to have this, like, negative, sense tied to it. But anyway, so they didn't believe that diseases they didn't believe that bacteria or viruses or cells were things that existed, and they didn't have evidence for them. They knew that the concept of them itself was never discovered or never thought of or never done in, like, practice. Now, the way my kind of rule is that I've kind of set up now is, if something is thought to be real but it's disputed, well, that's not a good way of setting it. Alright, take ghosts for example, which is what this whole video is about. Now, she said that we may discover something that is ghosts in the future, because we just haven't discovered it yet. But the problem is, we think that something like that can't exist. Or at least some people do. the human collective thinks that that may be a thing. The problem is, what are the chances that you think something's going to happen and then it does happen? It's more likely that you didn't even count for something and then it happens. Like, I can't really put it into words. What are the chances that the thing you thought that has very specific rules set up, like, ghosts leave cold areas behind. They could move objects. They could do this. They leave electronic voices. They do all this. Like, there's a very specific thing that ghosts can do. Which is actually quite a few things, but, no one ever says that, ghosts can turn sand into water. No one ever said that. But what are the chances that this very specific thing that you specifically think has specific abilities and specific purpose is a real thing that hasn't been discovered yet? Or the more likely alternative that something you didn't even consider was a real thing? The only like real, like, not anti, but like reverse of this or negative example, I can't really think of what the term is. I don't know, but the opposite of this, the kind of like exception or like proof that this isn't always the case, is take for example, atoms. When people don't always think, but a few philosophers, which were essentially scientists before they needed to actually prove their claims with physical evidence, not just speculation and what other option was there, was that you could only break something down so small before there's like an inert substance. Now, some people thought this was water because, water's found in almost everything, even rocks, which that's a whole different story. A lot of science stuff is coming up from things I've learned in science class. Maybe they were wrong about the whole you'll never need any of this thing. I don't know. But anyway, so people always thought, like, not always, but a lot of people thought for many years, or at least theorized that, there's something that can be only broken down to so small, and we eventually proved that true. But I don't think that exactly quite levels up with something so specific like ghosts, or something like ghosts, because it only stands to reason that you can't, that there's, when you break something down, there's something so small you can't physically break it. There has to be a smallest unit. There couldn't have been. There could not have been. Things could be break down infinitely. I don't know. See, the thing is, that wouldn't make any sense logically. Like, how would that even work? At what point would... I don't know. Anyway, so, my point is, people didn't think cells existed before they discovered them. People didn't think... The thing is, something is... You don't know, but it's more likely that a person or a concept is true when it was never thought of as a concept before it was discovered. Like, what's a good example? Like I said, cells. No one thought that there was cells, these little tiny things that made up all of life, that all had like that all had the same function, that all had one thing in common, which is DNA, and cells have a lot of things in common. As a matter of fact, there's like 3 groups of cells, like generally speaking, plant, animal, and fungus, and all 3 of those are very, very similar. Like, with the exception of a few things, they're pretty much the same. But no one ever thought that, because it's so absurdly specific of a thing. It's like saying... It's like wanting to prove that the sun is a flat disk made... no, that's not a good example. Scratch that. What's a good example? Like proving ghosts, for example. Because that requires so many things to be true. Like, for there to be ghosts. You know what? Scratch that again. 2 years ago, in my English class, some girl said the most insanely stupid thing that I still think about to this day, which was, you know, animals can hear ghosts. It's like a scientific fact. And like the rest of like that month, probably the whole year, was just kind of a bit of a blur because it was all, overshadowed by that one statement. But for that statement to be true, a bunch of other statements have to be true. Like, for one, to arrive at that conclusion, one, an afterlife of some extent must exist. Two, that afterlife must have some extent of manifesting itself in the physical world to our understanding of it. And three, animals, for some reason, not humans, every other animal can pick up on it for some reason. That's three things you have to prove before you get. That's like two things you have to prove that are really hard to prove to even get to the third thing. And I suppose that would be really weird if, like, we somehow empirically prove that, like, ghosts or something similar to them exist, but we, like, we scientifically prove that animals can't pick them up. Because then, like, you have, like, this entire, like, belief built up that they can, which would that just be considered superstition at that point? I don't know. It's not like we ever prove ghosts exist after anyway, because based on all logic and reasoning and current understanding of how the human brain functions and how, like, minds work, or how everything kind of works with the physical world, that it wouldn't even. There's no. It seemed there's too big of a jump between a normal conscious person and then a ghost, because there's so many steps that would have to be involved in that process. Like, it doesn't make much sense as, oh, you die, then you become a ghost. Well, how do you become a ghost? What are the... Not just like, oh, he never knew how he died. That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any logical sense. That would imply that, the human consciousness could simply will itself to continue on. But that doesn't make any sense, because why can't else? But the human consciousness is required for, like, a physical thing to manifest itself into, which is the brain. You can't have software without the hardware, because, without the hardware there is nothing. It's the medium for which it to be on. You can't have a wave without the ocean. I'm ranting again. The whole thing was a tangent. I don't know what I'm talking about. I'll see y'all whenever.